Hello and welcome to day one at the Psychedelic Liberty Summit. To dispel any possible confusion, you are on track 2 of the morning session, where you will meet 3 amazing women from the Women's Visionary Council.
Let's just see.
My name is Claudia Schwarz, and I'm your moderator and track guide for the next 100 minutes. Just to give you a brief idea of who I am, I'm a social scientist working in the field of science, technology, and society studies. Currently, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vienna and at MIT. For about 2 years now, I've been studying the ongoing attempts to medicalize psychedelics in the United States and how medicalization relates to other models for how we start to reintegrate psychedelics into Western culture. So my work nicely aligns with the overall mission of the Psychedelic Liberty Summit that seeks to broaden our horizon beyond medicalization and bring in different voices. One salient issue I recognize in the psychedelic space is that it is still very much dominated by men and the masculine perspective, despite the community's strong intent towards diversity. The visionary women from the Women's Visionary Council have already realized the need for the stronger inclusion of the feminine more than a decade ago. And they have decided to become active agents to change this unequal state of affairs. This session asks all of us how we can learn from the experiences of an established psychedelic community led by women. Annie, Eleonora, and Maria will tell us how they have tried to make female activists, scientists, healers, and artists more visible and heard in the psychedelic space since 2008. Among other things, they have hosted the Women's Visionary Congress now for 11 years. More recently, they have engaged with how to ensure safety and ethical practices in psychedelic therapy, ceremonies, and business. In their presentations, they will also explore how psychedelics can be used in the dying process and what the training of psychedelic therapists could and should look like. So I'm hoping they are already here. And so I would hope that one of them, I think Annie, is that correct? Annie, will you start with your presentation?
Well, I am, in fact, Maria Mangini, and I appreciate very much your introduction. You said a lot of, I think, very pivotal things about our organization. It's true we've been around for quite a while. At the time of the founding of this organization, the picture around psychedelics was quite a bit different. The inception of the organization came from the fest that was presented on the occasion of Dr. Hoffman's 100th birthday. And there were quite a lot of speakers who were invited to present in his honor in Basel. I had intended to be a part of that, but just shortly before the event, my father had a serious heart attack, and I thought it was an inauspicious time to leave the United States, so I declined to go. But if I had gone, I would have been one of the very few speakers on that panel of more than 70 who was female. There were only about 10% of the speakers at that time that were women. And other Women's Visionary Council founders, Ann Harrison, whom you'll be hearing from shortly, and Carolyn Garcia, who's sometimes also known as Mountain Girl, came back from that event and said, we have to do something about this. We have to start an organization that has an annual colloquium where there are 25 or so speakers and 2 or 3 of them are men. And we did, in fact, do that. The designation of the organization as a women's organization was primarily because of our original intention, which was to provide a platform that would privilege the voices of women at a time and in a situation when women's presentations were not heard very frequently in conferences or other events that had to do with psychedelics. And I'm going to have to ask you tech folks to help me with the cross background sound that I'm hearing, because I'm hearing a lot of the commentary from other tracks, and I'd prefer if we could not do that. Yeah, that's great. Let's have just track 2 playing right now. Let me see. So we were successful in doing that. We actually started an organization. We started having the annual meeting, which is the Women's Visionary Congress. And over the time that we've been doing that, the landscape around psychedelics and the position of women in that landscape has really changed significantly. We've been fortunate enough to invite some of the, I think now, highly significant players in this environment. Amy Emerson is one who comes to mind from the MAPS organization. Bera, who's also from MAPS, I think had their first opportunities to speak publicly at an event that we presented. And they've gone on to become very accomplished and in-demand public speakers, as have a lot of the other people who got their start at the Women's Visionary Council events. The outcome of that is that we really feel that the landscape has changed so significantly since the founding of this organization that we really prevailed in our intention to introduce the voices of women to a better level of access and appreciation. And as a result, we've recognized that we could focus our energies elsewhere. We've begun looking at the question about the diversification of the ethnicities and community and racial backgrounds of people participating in psychedelic research and therapy and the culture around psychedelics. And in our last major Congress event, we made a specific effort to include more people of color on the speaker panel. We were successful in doing that. So roughly half of the speakers who presented at that event were people of color. And we're working to make access to those platforms available to those people. In one of, we were asked actually to give some ideas about what has been our, what have been our practices and our methods in executing the aims of the organization. And one of the things that we recognized, which was different from the way that we originally conceptualized our invitations to speakers, was that if we were going to invite people who were working in communities where they were effective role models and leaders, that we were asking them to contribute energy that might otherwise be given to their communities to our organization. And because of that, we changed one of our practices significantly, which is that we began the practice of paying our speakers to appear, because we felt that it was important to compensate them for the time that they contributed to our concerns and interests and to the education of our community. Other than that, we had previously taken a leaf from another women's organization, the Northern California Women's Herbal Symposium, which is another long-lived women's organization in our neighborhood, which has some standards for who will be invited to speak. We sort of took a leaf from their book, and their practice is not to invite people who are already very famous, not to invite the same person to speak repeatedly, to try to encourage people who haven't had a platform on which to present their work to do so as a first opportunity. And we've been able to do that, I think, very successfully. As a result, we've been able to explore some of the things that we felt as an organization were uniquely of concern to women. One of which was the question of the level of acceptance and appreciation for qualitative methods of research as opposed to the quantitative methods. And that was also something that was an early concern for us. I think that this is also something in which we've achieved a certain level of success. I think many studies that concern psychedelics now appreciate that hypothesis generating studies and question finding inquiry and attention to the lived experience of people who might be being evaluated for other aspects of the study enriches the goals of the quantitative measurement that goes on. And I think that also is something that we have seen a notable amount of progress since the inception of our organization. So that's a little introduction of the Women's Visionary Council. For myself, I'm a family nurse midwife. I've been a nurse midwife since 1982. I developed my interest in the environment of birth largely because of my experience working for Dr. Stan Grof, who had hypothesized that the birth environment provides a a kind of template for transformative experiences of all kinds that people recapitulate throughout their lives. And I felt that as an agent for social change, my primary self-definition as somebody who came of age in the 1960s, that was a point of leverage where I could cause a lot of influence by giving people a birth environment that didn't violate and brutalize them as their first greeting in this world and community. So I began being very interested in intrapartum obstetrics, but as I have aged, my interest has shifted. I became interested in reproductive problems. I became interested in problems of the menopause. And now I've found that my midwifery interests have largely focused on death and dying. And this coincides nicely with my interest in psychedelics because there's a lot of very important and robust work that has been done to study the potential of psychedelics to help people with the existential angst that many people feel as they confront the imminence of the end of life. So these are all topics which might emerge further in our time together. And I just wanted to suggest them as possible reasons why somebody might have a question to ask us or something that you'd like for us to explore. And I think that it might be a good moment to yield the floor to my colleague.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Let me just maybe what I missed with Maria. Our next speaker is Annie Oak. She is founder of the Full Circle Tea House and the Women's Visionary Council. In addition, she's also founding partner of Take Fruit Presents, a San Francisco-based event production company that creates private immersive art parties. She's very active in developing risk reduction and safety manuals for participants in psychedelic spaces. And this includes the creation of protocols to address conflict and sexual assault. Great to have you here, Annie. And yeah, we can start with your presentation.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Maria, for kicking this panel off. My name is Ann Harrison, also known as Annie Oak. Together with Maria Mangini and Carolyn Garcia, also known as Mountain Girl, we are the founding board members of the Women's Visionary Council, which has produced the Women's Visionary Congress since 2007. I am speaking to you from Haight-Ashbury, which you can see outside my window, America's first psychedelic neighborhood, and I'm proud to still live here. We are a very strong community, and we send you our wishes from the center of San Francisco. I wanted to add a couple of comments about the WVC, the Women's Visionary Council, to follow on what Maria has said. We have made a point over the years of including a really wide range of people who have presented their work at our event. We have always included people of all genders. We include researchers, therapists, healers, activists, artists, spiritual leaders, people of all generations and all genders. We have laid a good foundation, I think, for the idea of inclusion and the support of both qualitative and quantitative research, as Maria has said. Our last Congress took place in Oakland, California last year. We focused very much on including as many people of color as we could confirm as speakers, and we had some wonderful people speak, and we're still on that process. It's a good start, and it's not the conclusion of that process. It's just the beginning of that process. We also have had many events throughout the US and Canada since 2007, including events in Canada and in Vancouver in particular, where we have had events in alignment with the community of people who work with risk reduction in British Columbia, and Eleonora Molnar will be speaking about that later also. So The WBC does make a point of paying our speakers. We raise money to provide grants to women working in this field. We feel very strongly that women should be compensated for their time. Women are typically not well compensated and underpaid in general. We gave each of our speakers at the Women's Congress a gift at the end of this year. We have just raised some money for a very specific purpose, and we have just given out the last grants in our granting round to elders. We feel very strongly that we want to support the passing down of knowledge between generations. And the COVID pandemic has really emphasized the vulnerability of elders. And we want to make sure that that wisdom is supported and included. And we have just given 2 grants out to elders in our community, and we're going to continue to do that. On our website, we have also just posted a video of Anne Shulgin's presentation on the shadow, which she gave at the Women's Congress last year. And you can see that at visionarycongress.org, which is our website. I also want to thank Maria as an elder for all of her many roles in our community over the years. I'd like to especially point to her role in my own neighborhood, her work with the Hate Street Clinic, where she was at all in one lifetime, a barefoot hippie runaway client, a clinician, and chairman of the board of that organization. So you see, we live many lives, and I just would like to acknowledge that. We also want to start a new project, WBC, called Ask the Elders, in which we pose 5 questions to an elder, and we'll be posting that on our website. 1, what is the pandemic teaching us about our relationship to others and ourselves? What does it teach us about the present state of our planetary ecosystems? What lessons in resilience can we learn from history? What advice do you have to those sheltering in place? And what project are you working on during this time that you will offer to the world? So we will be asking elders in our community for their reflections on this, and then offering that information on our website, which you can go to. I also want to emphasize the WBC has always been a very practical and pragmatic group of women. Many of us come out of the underground. We're outlaws, we're pranksters, activists, and rabble-rousers. We have a great time, and we throw great parties, and we produce events. We've been active socially in our communities for many years. Sometimes we're also quiet. Sometimes we like to fade into the background and shapeshift and become more invisible when that's necessary and when it serves us. We became public psychedelic people when it was much less safe to do that. When we started our first events, we had a bail fund. Those of us who lived through the past 40 to 60 years of our lives in psychedelic communities understand that people who choose to alter their consciousness with drugs are targeted for political persecution. That still happens, especially to people of color. And we need to be in alliance with all communities to continue to fight for drug law reforms and legislation that protect people who use all kinds of substances, not just plant medicines. We also want to point out that women make less money, are less able to defend themselves in court. If a woman uses substances, they have historically been accused of being bad mothers. This information is sometimes used against women and also men and people of other genders in child custody cases. As a result, we've always been very careful about the privacy of our members. We come out of a culture where talking about drugs was dangerous, and we survived that persecution, and we continue to do that. I'm not a giant fan of Facebook or Google groups. Those companies already have enough of our data. We have some strong misgivings about having entire communities go onto virtual platforms where third-party companies capture that information. And I think we should be aware of that. Be careful. Don't assume that you can't be targeted for your political beliefs or be the subject of asset forfeiture. I'm a journalist and I have covered those cases in federal court. And I don't think that we are completely out of the woods in terms of that kind of prosecution and persecution. The WBC founders also have seen a lot of good and bad behaviors in psychedelic communities. We see that some people can embrace messianic, kind of ego-driven impulses that psychedelics can sometimes spark. We have always addressed both the light and the dark side of psychedelics. We are cautious often of people who seek the limelight in these communities. We question their intentions. We don't assume that because somebody does psychedelics, they are inherently virtuous. We have spoken out for many years against sexual assault and the harassment of women and people of other genders in psychedelic ceremonies and during therapy. We have published a series of safety tips for people who participate in psychedelic ceremonies. You can find those safety tips on our website. And we also look at the ethics of companies and organizations in the psychedelic space. I was a business and science reporter for many years, and I'm very interested in the business models and patent strategies of companies that seek to develop psychedelic therapies. I've been writing some of those stories recently for an online news service called Lucid News. That's lucid.news, which I publish under my given name, Ann Harrison. Journalists must publish under their own name for transparency, and so I do. But this feels like an act of creative resistance because this project is led by some courageous journalists, many of whom are based in New York City, and I encourage you to check them out and also to support them. While I'm a skeptic by nature, I do believe that psychedelics can make us kinder, more courageous. They can put us more in touch with the earth, and it's important for all psychedelic communities to help rebuild ecosystems, forests, soil health. We also advocate for reaching out to other communities, to everyone who is engaged with the idea that psychedelics can be healing. They should reach out to local community organizations. We should get out of the echo chamber of our psychedelic societies, although we love them. Go talk to your local Rotary Club, your church. Show that you can be a good psychedelic citizen. I'm very encouraged by the huge growth of psychedelic communities all over the world. I think there's a lot of breadth and depth in those communities, and they don't represent just one large psychedelic community, but there are many. Members of the WBC have always looked for ways to help communities that have historically not had access to psychedelic therapies. Last year, the WBC became the fiscal sponsor of the SAGE Institute, a sliding scale clinic offering psychotherapy and psychedelic-assisted therapy to underserved communities in the San Francisco Bay Area. The SAGE Institute also trains clinicians who reflect the diverse identities of the people they serve, and we encourage you to support that project. You can do that by going to our website and making a donation to that project or to the WBC if you wish to do so. The WBC also raises funds for risk reduction workshops, which we have held for more than 5 years throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. We have pioneered a form of drug safety education where we work with trainers to teach participants how to use naloxone or Narcan to reverse opioid overdose and prevent people from dying. In the same workshops, we also teach people how to use reagent testing kits to check for the presence of potentially deadly adulterants. You can get these kits online from DanceSafe, which is a great organization that we have worked with in the past. Finally, we teach people how to properly use a milligram scale so that they don't overdose themselves or others. Our last risk reduction workshop took place in San Francisco in January and was done in collaboration with a group of other community organizations. We hope to hold more of these events in the future. And if you'd like us to work with you in your community to bring this workshop to your community, we would be happy to do that. We also have some videos of these trainings up on our website, which you can watch. And we have published also several guides to risk reduction best practices for event organizers, which is also very useful because they've been collected collaboratively by members of our community. You'll notice I'm using the word risk reduction and not harm reduction. I prefer the term risk reduction. I don't think all drug use is necessarily harmful. And so that's the phrase that I prefer. But I acknowledge that harm reduction and the movement behind that has been going on for many years. And we stand on the shoulders of people who pioneered those ideas and very courageous public health advocates and activists who come before us. Finally, I want to say that the WBC advocates for people who use all kinds of substances, not just people who use plant medicines. We stand up for the rights and the safety of people who use MDMA, ketamine, cocaine, opioids, nitrous, other kinds of pharmaceutical drugs. We believe that those people's lives are also worthy and that they deserve legal protections. They deserve public health support. They should not be shamed or marginalized. We try not to be pharmaco-chauvinists and assume that just because people use plant medicines, that makes them or their practices intrinsically better. We really try to adopt more of a human rights perspective. I come out of the human rights community, and we believe that the ability to change your consciousness is a human right. And the war on drugs has committed many human rights violations that we must all fight against. And I look forward to hearing from Eleonora Molnar, who is going to talk with us about some of the cutting-edge risk reduction projects in British Columbia, where the WBC has many allies and held events that amplifies the work of people in that community who are real pioneers in risk reduction and harm reduction activities. And she has some interesting things to say about psychedelic exceptionalism, and I'm excited to hear her speak as well. We hope to see you at one of our events when that becomes possible, and for the present moment online. And I wish you all well from the Center of Haight-Ashbury.
Thank you so much, Annie, for that really great presentation and all the insights you shared. So yeah, let's move on to Eleonora. Eleonora Molnar is a psychotherapist, healthcare systems planner, and an independent researcher with an interest in public and primary health, drug policy reform, and consciousness research. She studies the ethical issues and therapeutic approaches related to non-ordinary states of consciousness and healing. Eleonora is also the executive director of the Women's Visionary Congress in Canada.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for your great presentations, Annie and Maria. It's such an honor and privilege to be included with such decriminalization of psychedelics. If so, are you also interested in the decriminalization of all drugs? And if we're going to offer pure MDMA as medicine for some, would we be as willing to provide pure heroin as medicine for others? And these questions all relate to the theme of social justice, and my presentation will provide answers to these questions, of course, from a risk reduction point of view. And before I jump to the presentation, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the land on which I live, and I'm speaking from now, is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Squamish and Sechelt nations. I'm going to use my time on the panel to introduce myself very briefly, talk about why risk reduction is a topic at a psychedelic conference, talk a little bit about psychedelic exceptionalism, and provide some context and describe some risk reduction initiatives here in BC, particularly in Vancouver. So my name's Eleonora Molnar. I live in Roberts Creek, British Columbia, and my passion lies in exploring ethical issues related to non-ordinary states of consciousness. I'm a psychotherapist in private practice, and I've worked in the area of risk reduction and homelessness for 20 years, and as such, I'm involved with community groups that address homelessness and support people who use drugs. And I just want to say that I don't intend to speak on behalf of community groups comprised of people who use drugs, who have been active for a very long time, like VANDU, the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. However, I am an ally and an accomplice in support of the human rights and dignity of people who use drugs. And I feel that the topic of risk reduction fits well into the social justice theme of this conference. The primary issue, as I see it, is about safe supply and decriminalization. And unless we can provide safe drug products to people who use drugs, preventable poisonings will continue. We also need to stop criminalizing people who use drugs, because this only reinforces stigma and fills up prisons. And ultimately, the drug war on people who use drugs must end. And I just want to say a little bit about psychedelic exceptionalism. And this isn't a new topic. It's been around for some time. 3 authors wrote an article about it in Chacruna in 2018. Dr. Carl Hart has spoken about it at Horizons in 2019. David Bronner mentions it in the latest MAPS bulletin, and there's been a number of articles written about it. And psychedelic exceptionalism claims that less risky or less addictive drugs, such as cannabis, psilocybin, mushrooms, MDMA, or ayahuasca, are better and safer for people to use than other drugs, and heroin, alcohol, methamphetamine, or cocaine are treated as their opposites. So psychedelic exceptionalism not only stigmatizes certain drugs, but also the people who use them. And I think that there's something to be said about the current psychedelic decriminalization efforts, where the focus is only on some drugs, like psychedelics, and not others. This is drug exceptionalism, and it reinforces the stigma associated with the use of other so-called hard drugs. And I don't think that this distinction is particularly helpful. It's worthy of note that people of color, people living in poverty, those without homes, and those that have been in prison are disproportionately represented as people who use hard drugs. There's a number of reasons for this, including trauma as a result of health inequities, social and economic inequalities, including systemic racism, classism, sexism, ableism, xenophobia, and homophobia, among others. And of course, there's also the issue regarding the willingness of dominant power structures to see and treat substance use disorders as health issues, not as criminal ones. And just a word before I give some examples of risk reduction in British Columbia. Healthcare in Canada is universal and it's publicly funded. And some of the risk reduction services provided in British Columbia are unique to Canada. And the innovation that happens here is likely a direct result of the dire situation we face in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where there are high rates of homelessness and substance abuse. Risk reduction works. That's no longer up for debate. The evidence for risk reduction has only grown stronger over the years. Initiatives that prioritize health and welfare, guarantee human rights, and promote social justice save lives, but only when people are able to access them. And I'll say that again, only when people are able to access them. So in terms of the context here in British Columbia, in 2016, our provincial medical health officer declared a public health emergency under the Public Health Act in response to increasing overdoses and overdose deaths in our province. And this recent epidemic is characterized by the increasing proportion of deaths due to illicit fentanyl. And fentanyl barely had any presence in the US and Canadian markets until the last 6 years. In 2012, fentanyl was associated with 4% of fatal overdoses. And by 2018, that number had increased to 87%. Clearly, a safe supply will be able to end the crisis, and decriminalization would also be very helpful. And overall, progress towards racial and economic justice remains too slow. And so some of the risk reduction resources available in BC you may have heard of, and if not, perhaps some of these models could be implemented in the places where you live. Vancouver Coastal Health, the health authority where I live, provides risk reduction supplies, safe injection sites, overdose prevention sites, needle exchanges, take-home naloxone kits, along with risk reduction education and referrals to health services and social supports. And I'd have to say that there's probably more resources available in cities like Vancouver, as opposed to here where I live on the Sunshine Coast, a rural community. And here, Vancouver Coastal Health offers mobile risk reduction services. So clients call the mobile risk reduction coordinator and speak with him and leave a message about their needs. And he then arranges to meet clients to offer risk reduction supplies and collect used needles for safe disposal. Overdose prevention sites are often provided in homeless shelters and supportive housing facilities, and they provide a place where a person can be safely monitored, often by paid peers, while using drugs and treated immediately if they overdose. Overdose prevention sites also offer drug testing, provide risk reduction supplies, and risk reduction education and referrals. And basically, OP is a place where people can feel safe using. And peers are people with lived experience of substance use who are often engaged as experts and use their lived experience to inform health services. Peer engagement promotes health equity in programs and policies while building capacity, and peers save lives. I'm going to talk a little bit about supervised injection sites, and those are medically supervised facilities designed to provide a hygienic environment where people who use drugs are able to consume illicit recreational drugs intravenously. And these facilities operate under a Health Canada exemption from prosecution under federal drug laws. They strive to decrease the adverse health, social, and economic consequences of drug use without requiring abstinence. And supervised consumption sites are beneficial for the community and for residents because they help prevent people from transmitting infectious diseases. They encourage marginalized people to access healthcare services, including primary care and addiction treatment, and they bring stability to the community by providing public order and reducing the number of injections taking place on the street. So Insight is officially North America's first legal supervised consumption site. It's actually, truthfully, the Dr. Peters Center, a center to treat people who were suffering from AIDS in the West End of Vancouver, but it offered underground for many years. So on the books, Insight's the first legalized supervised consumption site, and it opened in 2003, and it's located in Vancouver's downtown east side, where there's a high number of people who use drugs, often by injection. And since 2003, there have been 3.6 million visits to inject illegal drugs under supervision by a nurse at the Insight Clinic. And there have been about 50,000 clinical treatment visits and 6,500 overdose interventions without any deaths, 0 deaths. And, you know, in this research around risk reduction, of how it's helping, there's some research done, and the calculation is that supervised injection sites and other risk reduction programs prevented more than 3,000 fatal overdoses during a 20-month period beginning in April 2016. So we know that these kinds of interventions work. And we have a unique organization here in British Columbia. It's called the BC Centre for Substance Use, the BCCSU. Along with our provincial government, published a document called Heroin Compassion Clubs, a cooperative model to reduce opioid overdose deaths and disrupt organized crime's role in fentanyl, money laundering, and housing unaffordability. And it outlines how people who use drugs could form cooperatives, co-ops. Members would require a visit with a physician who'd evaluate each individual's use of opioids. And then members could pool resources and negotiate to bulk purchase opioids from regulated suppliers. They could obtain diacetylmorphine and hydromorphone from regulated suppliers and use those drugs as relatively safe alternatives to unknown substances found on the street that are adulterated for sure. And by aggregating their purchase orders and relevant resources, members are able to take advantage of volume discounts, price protection, shared storage and distribution facilities and costs, and other economies of scale to reduce their overall purchasing costs. I want to also talk a little bit about the MySafe project. Vancouver is now home to a biometric opioid vending machine. And the vending machine is located in the downtown Vancouver's east side. I've talked about that before, next to an overdose prevention site. And the MySafe project is led by Dr. Mark Tyndall, a professor of medicine at UBC School of Population and Public Health. And it's basically an 800-pound machine that works kind of like an ATM to dispense hydromorphone to people who are registered opioid users. And it scans the vein pattern in a person's palm and then dispenses a small box with a safe dose of hydromorphone. And MySafe is also developing an app so people can track their drug use to see how many drugs they're using, when they last used. And Dr. Tyndall believes this project will help people who use drugs by giving them more autonomy, allowing them to pick up supplies at their convenience without having to visit pharmacies at specific times for witness dosing. And in all these risk reduction initiatives, our provincial health officer has recommended that the province move urgently to decriminalize possession of all illegal drugs for personal use, saying that the years-long overdose crisis needs to be treated as a public health issue, not as a criminal justice matter. And at the end of a report that she published called Stopping the Harm with our provincial government, she says, given the success of the Portugal model and faced with the restrictions and partial successes of BC's response to the overdose crisis, the provincial health officer of British Columbia recommends that urgent additional steps are needed to address the unrelenting toll of mortality experienced by individuals who are using illegal drugs. Specifically, that the province of BC urgently move to decriminalize people who possess controlled substances for personal use as a necessary next step in responding to the overdose crisis in BC. And I just want to talk a little bit about this wild, unique time that we're in, COVID time. The BCCSU and the BC government put out another publication recently. It's called Risk Mitigation in the Context of Dual Public Health Emergencies, Interim Clinical Guidance. And this document gives prescribers some clinical guidance on how to offer safe supply for vulnerable people during the COVID pandemic we're in. And interestingly, the pandemic has created an opportunity for safe supply, something drug policy reform advocates have been working towards for many years. And this is what the document says about the target population. This guidance aims to support individuals who may be at increased risk of overdose, withdrawal, craving, and other risks related to their substance use. As the effects of the pandemic continue, the drug supply may become significantly more adulterated and toxic, based on limited importation and availability, and illicit substances may become significantly more difficult to procure. Individuals seeking illicit substances risk both overdose and exposure to and transmission of COVID-19. Individuals with unstable housing may face additional challenges, physical distancing or self-isolating in order to reduce community spread of COVID-19. So it's interesting we have this safe supply, but what happens to safe supply and the people accessing it after the pandemic? Are we just going to say, you're safe, we're going to remove the safe supply and go back to what you're doing? I sure hope not. And talking about COVID, last week, the Vancouver police arrested 14 people after a group of community members of Vancouver's downtown east side broke into an elementary school to use it for what they called emergency housing. And spokespeople for the group said that the action was taken because it was impossible for thousands of homeless people to follow the provincial government's instructions to stay home amid the COVID-19 crisis. Many people don't have homes. When you're living on the streets, there's no way to follow COVID safety measures. There's no way to keep your hands clean. All the bathrooms are closed and there's no running water and there's no good healthy food to eat, said a spokesperson from Vandu. Hundreds of hotel rooms have been secured by BC Housing, but the rooms are only to house individuals once they have symptoms and need to self-isolate. So how do homeless people that don't have COVID-19 self-isolate safely? And this is a big question on many people's mind. Risk reduction and decriminalization are a social justice movement that respect the rights and humanity of people who use drugs. Risk reduction and decriminalization are not just about reducing the risks of drug use, but also about doing policy work, community organizing, and activism to reduce stigma and harmful drug policies. I hope that the so-called psychedelic community can take more action to entirely end the drug war on people who use drugs, not just those who use psychedelics. And if you're not outraged, you are not paying attention. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Eleonora, for your really fascinating presentation with so many interesting activities you're doing and amazing work. Thank you so much. I want to encourage the audience now to really ask their questions where they can. I see there's already some questions up there. But maybe let me just start with asking, I'm really curious now, since Annie mentioned this new part of their website where they're asking the elders these 5 questions. So I would be really curious to know how Maria would answer those questions for us, because she's obviously one of these amazing elders. And Maria, can you just maybe give a brief your take on the questions, or what are the questions and how would you answer them?
Well, these are very provocative questions, and they're intended to be that way. I think that Annie gave a little vignette about my personal history, and she was correct. I actually got an award from the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic for being the only person who had been a hippie runaway, one of the lead clinicians in one of the medical sections, and then the chairman of the board of directors, all in the same lifetime. So I have a perspective that spans a lot of the history of the changes in our attitude about some of these substances. And for many years, I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal story, in that my father was born on the armistice day of the First World War, November 11th, 1918. And that month of November 1918 was the peak time of the greatest number of deaths during the so-called Spanish flu pandemic of 1914-18. So that's been part of my family story all my life. And I've been a student of that pandemic for some time. I've read a lot about it, and I've thought a lot about it. And I know a disproportionate number of epidemiologists, because I served also on the board of the Saba Foundation for almost 20 years. And I've always, I live in a collective environment, an intentional community in Northern California. We have a rural lifestyle, and there's a lot of opportunities to be actively engaged with the manifestations of climate change that are obvious if you are close to the earth in your everyday life. And we talk about that a lot. So my difficulty has always been that I am, of course, concerned about climate change, but when people have asked me about what I thought we should do about the difficulties of the future, for many years I've been saying I'm betting on a virus. And I'm trying not to be smug about that. Anybody who knows me well has heard me say that at least once, because I've said it so many times. But I can't help but be in recognition of the way in which the natural environment is changing as a result of the diminution of the impact of humans on that environment. And I left my house to go to the ranch for the first time last Sunday. I went there and I drove across the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, and I couldn't believe how different the Bay Area looked from that perspective. The beautiful landforms of the city of San Francisco were visible because there was no pollution. And I think that I am hoping that, let me see, I had sort of imagined that the immediacy of the crises that are going to be provoked by human and Anthropocene impact on the planet might not occur in my lifetime, but now I'm not so certain. So I think that this is a long answer to a question about eldering and the nature of eldering. But for me, the people whom I consider to be my elders and mentors are increasingly at the end of their lives and are no longer available to me. And what that means is that a lot of us who are experienced in these areas need to step up and be frank and be able to be accessed by people who want to see what our perspective over time how our perspective has developed in our time in focusing on these subjects and the implications of those subjects. And then I just wanted to say one thing about something that someone asked in the question section, which is that someone asked for us to elaborate on the difference between harm reduction and risk reduction. And I'd like to say something about that because it's a particular subject that I'm interested in and have focused on for some time. I mentioned that I had a long relationship to the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, and the Free Clinic, the Free Clinic always has had a very large detox section, and throughout its life, that was one of the very big focus areas for the clinic to engage. And there was always a debate about whether the drug-free model that the Free Clinic embraced would really work for everybody. And that was always part of my interaction with the work of the Free Clinic, was that even in those early days, decades ago, I was very interested in, for example, the work of the Chicago Recovery Alliance, whose motto was any positive step. So they were early adopters and early respecters of the idea that you can't expect people to be cured in order to be treated. And that if people would move in the direction of doing behaviors and practices that would be less likely to injure them, so if people would pay their rent before they bought their dope, if people who injected intravenously would find another way to inject that was less likely to damage their veins or cause them to have severe outcomes like endocarditis, that those would be respected by people who are in the treatment environment. And once again, just as I've said, I've been betting on a virus for a long time. I've been betting on that approach, that any positive step should be respected and represents progress. So I just would like to say that I respect the term harm reduction because people like the Chicago Recovery Alliance and many other organizations who have engaged in harm reduction practices for many years have used that term. But I prefer the term risk minimization because it doesn't imply that the behaviors are intrinsically harmful. And actually, if I had my preferences, I would prefer that we would use the term benefit maximization, because people use drugs for reasons, not because they're stupid. And I don't think that we're politically quite ready for that, but that's the direction in which I hope we're going.
Thank you so much, Maria. There was one question concerning the use of the term elders. So who is an elder, or when do you qualify as an elder?
That is an interesting concept. And I think that one of the things about the governance that we experience in the larger society in North America is that we use an electoral process to put people in positions of authority and power. And that is not necessarily the way in which traditional communities have chosen the people who were their advisors and leaders. Usually what was, in my experience, more likely to happen was that people who had already shown some evidence of having good judgment in the area that was currently under consideration would be selected to be consulted in the future. And what that means is you have to kind of stay in one place. I have a particular interest in the use of the word community. As I said, I live in an intentional community that was largely coalesced around the insights that developed for us because of our experiences with psychedelics 50 years ago. And we've done what we could to actualize those insights in a practical way. And the result is that we are still around many, many years later. But what that means is you have to be available to people in their needs and troubles. And I think that in order for people to understand that they belong to a community, they have to put themselves in the position of supporting the members of their community when there are needs which they have the capacity to fulfill that are being felt by those community members. And I think that history of having functioned in that way is one of the things that is taken into consideration, in my view, in defining who is a community elder, is who has made themselves available with whatever their abilities or resources were to support other members of the community in their times of need.
Mm-hmm. Great definition. Thank you so much. Yeah. Let me move to the questions now. There's, at the top, there's the question about, what advice would you give to young women who hope to make an impact on the field of psychedelic research? So who of you would like to tackle this question first, maybe?
Maria, would you like to address that? You work and train with people in the CIS cohort, yes?
True enough. That's I was kind of not thinking about that because I was thinking of people who primarily are interested in research, but our trainees certainly are part of the research environment, and that part of the competencies that are established in the program have to do with the research environment. I think patience is a real characteristic that has distinguished a lot of the people who have achieved some of the really important progress that we've seen in the last decade or so. A lot of the foundational work which went into, for example, the production and publication of the very robust and astonishingly productive studies that have come from, say, for example, Johns Hopkins or Harvard, UCLA, or NYU, involved practices that began a long time ago with people who took a long view about the slow pace with which foundational research in the orthodox research environment is developed. So I think patience and persistence is really a very important characteristic. But just talking about the work that we're doing at the California Institute of Integral Studies in the Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research, it's clear that there are, with the popularization of these topics, with the publication of the work of, say, for example, Michael Pollan, who has been extremely influential in bringing this to the public view, a lot of people would like to, or can envision that they would be benefited by psychedelic assisted therapies. We are doing the utmost in our capacity to train as many therapists and researchers for that need as it is possible to do. But in order to do that, the capacity of our program is far outstripped by the need that exists. And I think that one of the things that has to happen is that people have to develop other approaches to training and more programs that will take on the responsibility of training those people. I want to proceed cautiously in that recommendation, however, because I know that, for example, the environment around the use of MDMA as a medicine is still really in the complex setting of being assessed by the regulatory bodies, and they are very intent on establishing who is an appropriate practitioner for a skill of that kind. So I don't want to upset that process by recommending that we do something radically different, but we're going to have to scale up training and education and opportunity for people to learn how to provide these therapies for people very rapidly if we're going to keep up with the demand. And I look forward to the time when other educational institutions are going to be able to recognize that that's a real project that's worth engaging in. I think that the people who are very likely listening to me speak at this moment have already some awareness of how useful some of these practices and therapies can be. And I want to encourage them to go out and speak to other communities where that realization has not yet dawned. I think that's one of the things that we can do that will really make a big difference for the future. To speak to our professional organizations, to our faith-based groups, to other organizations where we have a presence and we can surface our appreciation of the utility that some of these substances have in achieving goals that are important in human lives, and decrease the amount of misinformation and disinformation that has been disseminated by the drug war in the communities that we inhabit for decades.
Thank you, Maria. Another question that was posed is concerning the issue of psychedelic exceptionalism that Eleonora raised. And the question is whether decriminalization is maybe a necessary first step towards destigmatizing drugs as such, and whether then the rest might follow, or whether it indeed is psychedelic exceptionalism, and how to deal with that. So maybe Eleonora, you can address this question.
Hi, I'm sorry, my internet was acting a bit strange, and I repeat it.
Did you hear the question I was asking?
I'm sure she'll
I'm
break
sorry,
in. Oh, there you
are, Claudia.
Yeah, it looks like your connection isn't working that well, right, at the moment.
I think that by turning off your video, you may have gotten better audio. Claudia, would you mind asking her again?
What's happening? I missed the question.
Yeah, Eleonora. Okay. So the question was, do you hear me? Eleonora? Eleonora, are you there? Can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, I hear you too. This is great. So yeah, the question was on whether decriminalization is a good first step towards maybe also decriminalizing other drugs, or whether it's really psychedelic exceptionalism.
Hi, thank you for putting the question in the text box. Decriminalization in the US is a first step to decriminalize other drugs, and I do think that that is the case. I feel that cannabis decriminalization in Canada especially has provided a platform now for psychedelics, and I think that other drugs will kind of piggyback on top of that. It creates more openness for other drug products. Definitely, I think that cannabis has helped. Next might be all the other drugs. My preference would be all drugs at the same time, but I do think we have a cascade effect.
Would somebody else, Annie, do you maybe want to say something on the topic?
About psychedelic exceptionalism? Yeah, I do. I think it's really important to remember that people who use psychedelics often use other substances as well. Because psychedelics, and especially plant medicines, are, I think it's fair to say, are now perceived as more acceptable. People tend to be quiet often about their use of other substances, and I worry about that. I worry about this notion of being shamed because you like to use opioids, or you occasionally use cocaine, or MDMA has helped you in some way. I think it's important not to be pharmaco-chauvinists and to keep an open mind, to not judge people because they may prefer a synthetic molecule over a plant medicine. It's really important to honor the decisions that all people make about changing their consciousness and to care about their lives to support research and projects that address their issues. I think there's just a lot of silence often in psychedelic communities about the use of other substances. That doesn't mean they're not being used, and doesn't mean that those people shouldn't also be recognized, even if they don't want to talk publicly about their use, which is fully understandable. It's still very dangerous to do that. It's much easier to talk about your ayahuasca experience than your experience with ketamine, for example. I'm very involved in risk reduction projects, especially in immersive art party and festival settings. And we try very hard to offer on-site, on-demand, anonymous testing services. I want to give a shout out to the people at the Boom Festival in Portugal for pioneering those services. We are fully inspired by that community. They have really inspired and challenged the entire world to offer similar services. It's more difficult to do here in the US because we face a different legal environment, but I strongly believe that it's important to be courageous and keep your view on the far horizon for what is ethically correct and serves the greatest number of people. And I do believe that on-site, on-demand, free drug testing services should be widely available at all events, and that event producers should offer them and find a way to do that that works within their comfort zone.
Great. Thanks, Annie. Another question that's posed is, how shall women talk to other women about psychedelics? This person, she's also mentioning that she encounters a lot of women who are against psychedelics for understandable reasons. And yeah, she would like to get some advice on how to speak to other women. Who would like to address this question?
Let me say a little bit about the safety tips, and then perhaps Annie, you would take this on, because this really is your topic area, I think. And Ellie too, you definitely have done a lot of exploration in this area, but I just wanted to, on a lighter note, the safety tips that appear on our website were actually a group generated phenomenon. When we started this organization, the name, the Women's Visionary Council, came out of an acknowledgement from the benefit that we as the founders had from scouting, which was a female-oriented experience of our young lives. And so after the Girl Scout Council, we developed the Women's Visionary Council as a name. And at one time, we actually talked about giving merit badges as one of our, and it was kind of a joke, but it was not entirely a joke. That evolved into a practice that we engaged in at some of our early residential meetings, where we asked people for what we then called Heloise's. If you ever saw Heloise's household hints in the comics as a child, this was Psychedelic's household hints. And we asked people to offer little vignettes of wisdom that they had accumulated through their psychedelic experiences. And that evolved into the safety tips, which you can now find on our website. And I wonder, Annie, if you would say a little bit about that. And also, Ellie, if you would talk a little bit about your experience with the unique situation that women find themselves in this area.
Yeah, our safety tips were compiled from input from different members of our community. You can find them on our visionarycongress.org website under projects. We compiled some good ideas that women and people of all genders can use to help stay safe while engaged in psychedelic ceremonies or other kinds of psychedelic experiences. We think that they're useful. We published them a number of years ago, and they've been widely circulated. If you have suggestions for updating these tips, we'd like to hear from you. This is a collaborative project, as many of our projects are. You can email us at info@visionarycongress.org. I think it's really important to develop a safety plan when you decide to participate in a psychedelic ceremony or go to a festival where psychedelics may be in use, or another kind of healing event, work with a therapist, or whatever it is you're doing. Think about your own well-being. Think about your safety. Develop a plan to support you if that experience goes well, or if the experience does not go well. What is your backup plan? I think that's really essential. Also, somebody had an earlier question about how women in particular can find other women to talk about these topics. Many years ago, when I felt like I didn't have enough people to, especially women, to talk about these topics with, I started a book group. And we decided that we were going to select some books about topics concerning psychedelics that interest us, and that we were going to read those books together. It was very much modeled on my own mother's great books groups that she was always part of. So it's a simple way to find some people who live in your local area, select a book that you all find interesting, read it, then come together and have a discussion about that book, share ideas, make some tea, some tasty foods, sit and when we're able to do this again in somebody's living room, or meet in a park and sit 6 feet apart, but find a way to connect in a direct way where you can share ideas, exchange thoughts, and really read some of the resources that are available to you collectively. That's a very simple and easy way to start.
Thanks for sharing this amazing idea of the book club. I have to say I really like it a lot. And can I just ask you, are there any specific books you can recommend that also focus more on female voices in the psychedelic space? Because as all of you might know, Michael Pollan's book isn't really a big resource in that sense. It's lacking female voices. And so, I would love to get some recommendations for more, feminine-oriented psychedelic books from you.
Yes, I would like to make a specific recommendation for a book that was recently published called Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine. It's a collection of essays, and I was one of the contributors. And I am looking at that book right now on my bookshelf, and I'll bring it over in just a moment. It was a wonderful collection of writers from around the world. The editors were brilliant. It is not U.S. focused, which I found very refreshing. And it was a wonderful project to be involved with. And I encourage more people to write, and more women in particular, to write essays, to document your research, to journal, to do whatever form of writing speaks to you, and then find a group of people to share your writing with.
Thank you. It's a great book. I have it too. Eleonora, do you want to join?
Hi, I think it's a great book. I was all how I'm very interested in. 10 years ago, women started coming to me because they knew I was interested in psychedelics and started telling me stories of your business. Who do you think you are, the world's policeman, to start talking about these things. And it's so interesting over the last 10 years how these abuses have come to light, and more people are aware and are taking precautions to minimize those risks and maximize the benefits of their drug experiences. And it was so wonderful to find the women of the WVC 10 years ago, because they're people who understand these issues. And when we organized Vancouver events, one particular event, we had a round circle of about 60 participants, and we all had a few minutes to share about our experiences. And we talked all about the abuses of power, and the circle went around and around. Everyone had a certain amount to speak. And when it was time to break for bio breaks or snack breaks, we didn't break because people were so engaged. We talked for hours, and I feel that people really need a space to talk about their experiences. And now we see the rise of integration circles where people can share their experiences about their psychedelic journeys and possibly other journeys with other substances that they are taking. And that when
Ellie, I'm really sorry that we're not hearing you right now. But until we get you back, I wanted to recommend not just a book, but the entire work of one of the writers whom I think is one of the most lucid of the early psychedelic experimenters and writers, a woman named Lisa Bieberman. And I'm going to post a citation that can be accessed online that has one of her really, I think, phenomenal works called The Narrow Time. But really, just almost anything that she wrote is extremely thoughtful and beautifully written. She has a wonderful command of language, and she clearly had some deeply profound experiences with psychedelics very early in the dawning of awareness in this country of their usefulness as part of a spiritual practice.
So the question that's most calling to be answered now is the question on how people can get involved in your work and support the WVC. So that shows how much excitement you already generated through all your stories and all your knowledge that you shared among the audience. So, yeah. So how can they become active and support you?
We would really welcome people who would like to be in touch with us. And we want to emphasize here that's people of all genders. Our organization, our events have always been open to people of all genders. And we feel that that is extremely important. We preference the voices of women, as Maria says, but we are a community of allies, and we welcome those allies. You can visit us on our website at visionarycongress.org. We just posted some of the videos from the Women's Congress that took place last year. We will be posting Ask the Elders in a series starting in the next few days. You can email us at info@visionarycongress.org directly and propose ideas, invite us to speak on podcasts or events that you're organizing. We do a lot of speaking, and we've done that over the years, and we will continue to do that. We have a very distinct perspective, and we'd really like opportunities to share that perspective. We have also served kind of as a booking agency over the years. When we first began to host the Women's Visionary Congress, there were very few women speaking at conferences and events. I covered those events early on, some of them as a journalist, and I was really struck by this. And our attitude has always been, if you want to change the world, throw a better party. And so we held our first Women's Congress in 2007, but we have also advocated for other women, emerging researchers, healers, artists, activists who want to get their voice heard. And what we have done over the years is contacted event producers and said, we've noticed that there are no women on your panel, on your lineup. Could we suggest some? And by and large, that's been quite successful. And we feel a lot of satisfaction that we've been able to help promote the work of women we admire, and also people of all genders. We have promoted the work of men, the work of trans people. It's something we're quite proud of. So please get in touch with us and let us know what you're doing. And we do reach out to event producers and conference organizers to make sure that more voices are heard, and in particular, people of color as well. We want their voices to especially be heard, and we want to see more of that happening.
Thanks, Annie. I just want to follow up here a little bit concerning this issue of whether you think it's important to also have spaces like this session here now, where we are just women, right? It's just a women-only session. And at the same time, as you just mentioned, it's important to get women into other panels and events where there's mainly men, right? To kind of get our voices heard there. So are there specific strategies you would suggest for organizers and women who want to create spaces? Should they focus on maybe creating these women-only spaces, or what's your experience? What works, or what should we do?
Well, one interesting and thoughtfully constructed suggestion, excuse me, that I'm aware of is comes from the Students for Sensible Drug Policy through our current board member, Danielle Schumacher, who's not present on this call, but has been very helpful and influential for us in bringing some of these ideas to us. And that is that when one is asked to participate in a conference or to give a public talk, that you can use your leverage as a desirable contributor to see who else has been included, and decline to participate if the organization that's inviting you has not been inclusive of other people who might not have as easy access to an opportunity to present.
An event producer. Yes, thank you. I would agree with what Maria just said. I have emailed event producers out of the blue and said, this panel looks so interesting. I really think it would benefit from a wider range of voices. Please consider doing that, and don't just invite the same people that we've all heard from over and over. Expand your horizons. When we curate speakers for the Women's Congress, we really try to reach out to people we don't know, try to reach out to communities that we don't know as well as ours, to try to reflect more plurality of voices and perspectives. And it's not always easy. And sometimes it's a challenge. It's not been easy sledding always, but it's worth doing. And if people do that on a wider scale, we will hear from a much wider range of views, and we will strengthen our own understandings and our own communities that we're part of by doing that. And so speak up, reach out to organizers, point out that those people on the panel, we've heard from them a lot. Let's hear from some new people and get some new perspectives.
Great tips. Thank you so much. I want to ask another question that has been posed. It's asking, is there any research currently being done to create manuals or best practices for integrative healing practices post-psychedelic therapy, so for integration, particularly for PTSD in women caused by sexual abuse? Do you know of any resources in that direction? Any? You are speaking, but not. Yeah, great.
Thank you. Organizations that I've been part of have been focused on processes for restorative justice and conflict mitigation, de-escalation. There are some best practice materials that we have worked on. If you email me, I can share those with you. I think there need to be more collections of best practices for people who are working with populations who are receiving therapy for trauma. I really encourage people to develop those best practices in a way that can be shared with a wide audience and share that information. I think that's really essential. I also feel that there should be an expansion of best practices for online support. Here we are in our online environment. We're going to be in online environments for some time, I think, meeting like this. And there are some interesting best practices emerging to provide telemedicine, online support in ways that make therapy and healing accessible to a larger number of people and do it safely in a time of social distancing.
Another question. Do you think it is possible to destigmatize psychedelics in academia as a tool? Or are we already in the process, I would add, of destigmatizing psychedelics in academia? What's your take? Who wants to answer that?
Ellie, do you want to speak to that?
Hi there. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me. I'm so sorry that I keep going out. There is a huge rainstorm that went by my house. I don't know if it has anything to do with my connectivity. I really do feel, though, Maria, that you are the best person to speak about destigmatizing psychedelics in academia, because that's where you are. Can I defer to you, please?
I'm fond of saying I have a PhD in LSD. Because I am a nurse, and because nursing is a spacious environment, both professionally and clinically and intellectually, I was permitted by an equally spacious environment, the University of California, San Francisco, which is the real horticonclusi, the real walled garden of academia, where really almost any kind of interest is legitimate as long as you bring a high level of scholarship to your inquiry. to, in 1994, begin researching the impact of psychedelic experiences on the lives of people who were at that time at least 40 years old. All those people are considerably older now that were part of my study population. But some very, very interesting findings came from doing that research. And the title of that, of my doctoral dissertation, which is what came of that, is Yes, Mom Took Acid. And in order to elicit participation, I had a button that said that I used to just wear on my jacket when I went out in public. And people would come up to me in a bookstore or a supermarket and say, "What's that button about?" Because they were dying to tell me about the experiences that they had had. And so there's a very large population of people who have reached the stage of life where they're in a position of influence in their communities, potentially, who have had these experiences, some of them quite a long time ago. But for many people, it represented a significant change in their life trajectory. And so they've arrived at a really different place in their lives from the one that they would have reached if they hadn't had those experiences. I know that certainly is true for me. And the reason that I would tell you all of that is that in order to be able to succeed in a long-term academic endeavor like a doctoral process, you really have to be committed to the subject that you're studying. You have to have what I would call cognitive lust. You have to want to know every possible factoid that could be available about that subject, and that involves something that Stan Grof taught me to call Sitzfleisch, which I believe that it means literally, I think it means sitting flesh, or basically having a big behind. But I think the way it's used, it means being able to stay in your chair, like being able to stay there and do the work. And you have to have that. And if you don't have a big interest, you can't really expect to have that. So all of the people who've turned out for this kind of a conference have that to one degree or another. And I would encourage you to do, or I would encourage that it is possible to do the thing which we always offer to students in trying to pick a topic to follow in graduate study, which is to pick something that matters, pick something that has been a problem in the community in which you live, pick something about which you care desperately and follow that. And I think that beyond that, it would be imprudent for me to talk about where people should take these investigations in the academic environment, because they have to have that personal passion in order to make it work. I do also, though, feel like I want to acknowledge the late John Perry Barlow, who was one of the few early people to really encourage people who had progressed and acceded to positions of influence in their communities to stand up and own their psychedelic experience and the impact that experience had had on their lives. And to be able to say, yes, I did it, and it did me a power of good. And I have found that has been very effective in working with my students. But they have to be able to get a look at me first. They have to be able to experience me as somebody who has still got a few neurons left, who is on their side, who is willing to go to bat for them when they have trouble in the academic community, who has interesting things to say. And then when I reveal that information, it is an encouragement for them when they think about drugs. Because I taught for several decades at a small private college in Oakland, which is one of the most diverse campuses in the United States. The U.S. News and World Report said that it was in the top dozen or so for the multiplicity of ethnicities and backgrounds that are represented in the student body. And a lot of my nursing students were nurses from Highland Hospital, which is the county hospital here in Oakland. And they come from roots in the African American community where there has been a drug nightmare that's been going on for decades. And I can't refute that. I wouldn't wish to. That's their experience. But what I can do is offer myself as somebody to add to the understanding that those students have of drug users. And I have stood up in front of my nursing students and said, well, when you think about drugs, I want you to recognize that I'm probably, this was maybe in the 1990s. It might not be so true anymore, but I'm maybe in the top 10% of people in this country who've used certain kinds of drugs. And when you think about drugs, you have to think about me. So if you think that I have something to say, I want you to appreciate that a lot of that came from the good that was done for me by experiences that I've had with drugs. even ones that are socially reprehended.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, I love the term cognitive loss, and others also mentioned it. I see all of you are having it for sure. And I think we also had a lot of Sitzfleisch in this session, which is, as a German speaker, I can say you really captured that term. It's also about staying in your seat and not being, not leaving it and not being pushed out of it, and really staying in there for the fight, the good fight. And I see, you're three perfect, examples for how to do this and how to generate that necessary Sitzfleisch in this struggle for bringing women into the conversation, and also in the struggle for risk reduction or maximizing the benefits of drug use, as you also wonderfully mentioned. And we have like 2 minutes left, and maybe just each of you wants to maybe say a few last words, and what you maybe want to give all of us on our way and for our work as women and other leaders and activists and scientists in this space. So maybe just like a 30-second last word round. Eleonora, maybe you can start.
Sure. I just want to thank everyone for being part of this panel. I'm so sorry for my technical difficulties. I want to remind people that this community women is there for you to hear about your psychedelic experiences, to share, to provide advocacy, to provide research for these kinds of discussions that we're having, and that it isn't just about psychedelics, that it's a much broader based movement that we're part of, a social justice movement, and that no one should feel alone, and that they should feel part of this. And if they ever are feeling alone or feeling like they're out there in the woods by themselves, please connect to the WVC. The Women's Visionary Council is there for you, and we want to hear from you, and we'd like you to join us and to be with us as we continue this work. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And maybe Annie next.
I'm feeling a lot of gratitude for the people who organized this event. Thank you to Chakruna and the technical staff who assisted us today. Thank you, Claudia, for being our MC. I'm very encouraged by the expansion of psychedelic communities around the world, by the eagerness of people to collaborate and share ideas and be open to new ideas. And I'd like to encourage people to practice forms of that in their own life, to support researchers, research organizations, nonprofits like ourselves. Take a careful look at the for-profit companies entering this space. I'm particularly interested in issues of intellectual property, patenting, business models, fundraising. Be discerning, be skeptical, but be open to new ideas, and be kind to people who might not share your views. I think that psychedelics teach us courage, and they teach us kindness, and they give us a sense of being connected to a larger world. And we here at this present moment online have been connected together for this period of time. And for that, I'm very grateful. And I send out my best wishes to all of you. Please stay in touch.
Thank you, Annie. And last words to our wonderful elder, Maria. People are already so inspired by you that they say they want to be like you when they grow up.
Oh, dear. you know, there's a lot of really wonderful, thoughtful writing about all of this. And there are certain things that I always find that I come back to again and again. And in keeping with what Annie was just saying about about the fact that we all are connected, I had the very good fortune to experience Joseph Campbell directly because of my work with Stan Grof, for whom he was a quite close ally and good friend. And in his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, he sums up this process as well as anybody possibly could. He says, we have not even to make the journey alone, because the heroes of all time have gone before us. And where we thought to find an abomination, we will find a god. And where we thought to slay another, we will slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outwardly, we will come to the center of our own existence. And where we had thought to be alone, we will be with all the world. And I think that's extremely correct. And I appreciate very much being given the opportunity to talk to this audience about these things. And I join with you in that journey. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of it.
Thank you, Annie. I think you are not just heroes, you're heroines for all of us. And we're all on our heroines' journeys together, as you said. And it has been amazing to host this panel, and I look forward to connect with you in the future and with all of you, and let's enjoy this wonderful moment at the summit and share all our perspectives, and thank you so much, and see you.